At first glance, London may seem like the epitome of a modern metropolis. Crowded streets, flashing billboards, and the constant hum of city life. But beneath the surface lies a rich tapestry of history, waiting to be uncovered. Tonight, we'll take you on a journey through time, revealing how a humble Roman settlement grew into one of the world's most iconic and thriving cities, home to nearly 9 million people. Through invasions, plagues, fires, and even a tornado, London has weathered it all, emerging as a symbol of resilience and greatness. Our adventure begins with an unexpected discovery beneath Trafalgar Square, an archaeological find that opens a door to the past. From there, we'll trace the relentless expansion of the city through centuries of transformation, from ancient roots to modern-day marvels. So sit back, relax, and let your mind wander as we peel back the layers of London's sleepy, hidden history. Picture Trafalgar Square, now teeming with tourists, buses, and the buzz of everyday life. But close your eyes for a moment and imagine what it looked like long before the crowds arrived. This square feels like the very center of London, and indeed nearby Charing Cross is the point from which distances from the capital are traditionally measured. As the location of the National Gallery and with Nelson's column towering over the square, there's also a real sense of history in this part of London. You can imagine that this place has seen it all the changes that have taken place over the centuries. Relatively speaking, most of the architecture in Trafalgar Square isn't that old. The National Gallery was built in the 19th century, as were most of the fountains and monuments. But the area now known as Trafalgar Square has been a significant part of London since at least the 13th century, and it's also the site of another hidden history. In the 1950s, during building work in Trafalgar Square, some ancient remains were unearthed. Cave lions, wild ox, hippopotami, and rhinoceroses. These beasts lived in the area during the last interglacial period, approximately 120,000 years ago. It's surreal to imagine that here, where taxis wait at traffic lights, a rhinoceros once roamed. However, the true history of London has to begin with the area's human inhabitants. Humans first arrived in Britain much earlier, perhaps as early as 800,000 BCE. It seems likely that humans were also living in the London area hundreds of thousands of years ago. There's some evidence of activity, such as stone tools and human remains, but London wouldn't become an official settlement for quite some time. During the New Stone Age, around 4000 to 2200 BCE, communities in Britain began to live a more settled existence. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle was phased out as people turned to agriculture and began to domesticate animals. By the Bronze Age, the London area probably consisted of scattered farming settlements. There would have been lots of sheep, cattle, and a relatively new development, domesticated horses. By the Iron Age, which began in 700 BCE, horses were being used to pull carts. Trade and travel were now much more accessible, and the people living in the area were more connected with the outside world. London was on the cusp of existence, but it was only officially established in the 1st century, the period around 43 to 47 CE. The Romans had just conquered Britain, and they needed a strategically located base near the river. They chose an area on the bank of the River Thames, and they named it Londinium. In a sense, this is where our history of London really begins. With the Romans, Londinium was small. It occupied a space of about half a square mile. To put that into perspective, that's about the size of the present-day Hyde Park. You could have walked from one end of the city to the other in about half an hour. Londinium was located on the north bank of the River Thames. Roughly speaking, it corresponded to the district that we now know as the City of London. That's the area where St. Paul's Cathedral now stands. The Romans established Londinium for strategic reasons. Its location, on a low point of the Thames, made it easy to access both by land and sea. It was the ideal site for a port. Londinium soon became an important trade hub for the Romans, and over the years, the population quickly expanded. By the 2nd century, Londinium was home to as many as 60,000 people. It was growing in grandeur too. At the time, the city's basilica, a building that housed law courts and other civic institutions, was one of the largest structures north of the London Wall. Building work began around 200 CE, and when completed, the wall stretched for more than 2 miles, encircling the city. Repairs and additions were made in medieval times, and some of the wall still survives today. An impressive section can be seen near Tower Hill Tube Station. In the second half of the 2nd century, a major fire seems to have destroyed much of Londinium. There may have also been a plague. Whatever the cause, the city's population shrank. This was a pattern that would often be repeated over the years to come. Expansion followed by a disaster, then a period of rebuilding and growth. In Roman times, Londinium never quite regained its former glory, but it was still the capital of Roman Britain, and it retained a reasonably sized population. These days, London is known for being an incredibly diverse and cosmopolitan city, and to some extent, this was also true from the beginning. Londinium was a melting pot. From DNA analysis, we know that many inhabitants came from continental Europe, while others had Middle Eastern or North African ancestry. Some people would have come for work. Soldiers, for example, or merchants, though not everyone got a choice in the matter. Some of the city's inhabitants were slaves, forced to migrate with their masters. Again, this would be a recurring theme in London's history. As with so many other cities, it's often been a place of inequality. In the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was under strain. Overwhelmed by economic problems, political turmoil, and attacks from barbarian tribes, something had to give. So, in the year 410, when the British begged the Roman Emperor Honorius for military assistance, he declined. This effectively marked the end of the Roman era in Britain. The people of Britain and Londinium were on their own. The following years are a bit of a murky period, historically speaking. There's not much in the way of archaeological evidence or written records, so we don't know exactly what was going on in Londinium. But while the city wasn't abandoned overnight, it did fall into decline. Without Roman wealth and protection, deterioration was inevitable. We can imagine Londinium as a much smaller, humbler city. Buildings falling into ruin, and the great walls overgrown. Eventually, the city may have been abandoned altogether. After the Romans left Britain, some new settlers arrived. They were Germanic tribes, originating from the countries now known as Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Some may even have arrived while the Romans were still in Britain. However, most migration and settlement took place during the 5th and 6th centuries. These settlers would come to be known as the Anglo-Saxons, and they would dominate Britain for 500 years. Just like the Romans before them, the Anglo-Saxons needed to establish some new settlements. Instead of taking over the old Roman city of Londinium, they decided to settle just outside the walls, to the west. By the late 7th century, there was a new London, Londonwich. The name meant London trading town. Like Londinium, London, which was strategically placed on the northern bank of the River Thames. It occupied the area that we now know as Covent Garden. Today, many of London's theatres are located around Aldwych. The name Aldwych means Old Settlement or Trading Town, a reference to the area's Anglo-Saxon origins. Apart from its geographical location, we don't know much about Londonwich, but gradually it must have grown in size and importance as a trading center. A significant development took place in the late 9th century, during the rule of Alfred the Great. The focus of settlement seems to have shifted from Londonwich to its next-door neighbor, the old Roman city of Londinium. One likely reason for this is that Londinium still had its Roman walls. These were refortified to provide protection from Viking invaders. So what was once Londinium became the new city center. It was known as Londonburg. But from now on, to keep things simple, we'll just use the name London. Though the name was first recorded as early as the 1st century, it wouldn't become widespread or formalized until much later. The Anglo-Saxon era might be considered a new start for London, a city both young and old. It marked the official beginning of the City of London, a specific district that still exists today. To an extent, its boundaries are still marked by the old Roman walls. These days, the London Wall is just a monument. But in Anglo-Saxon times, it offered much-needed defense. Back then, London probably felt like a rather precarious place to live. From the 9th century onwards, there were frequent Viking invasions. London Bridge may have even been destroyed in the early 11th century, during an attack led by Olaf II of Norway. Some believe that this event might have inspired the famous nursery rhyme, "London Bridge is falling down." The population of Anglo-Saxon London fluctuated over the years, but at its peak, it's estimated to have been no more than around 15,000. About a quarter of the size of Londinium in its glory days. Anglo-Saxon London seems to have been a modest hub of trade and commerce. But again, it couldn't compare to Londinium. And in terms of architecture, it had nothing to rival the grandeur of the old Roman monuments. Nonetheless, the city was gradually taking shape. In 1042, after a period of Danish rule, Edward the Confessor became King of England. Edward was an extremely pious Christian. He ordered the construction of a grand new church west of London. Westminster would later become part of central London. But in Edward's day, although it was geographically very close, it was still separate. The church that Edward commissioned came to be known as Westminster Abbey. He also had a palace built nearby, allowing him to oversee the work. Edward lived just long enough to see the consecration of Westminster Abbey. His project had some important consequences. It established Westminster as a place of both religious and political significance. And again, while Westminster was not yet considered part of London, we can see the gradual westward spread of the city. Edward the Confessor died in 1066. His death sparked a succession crisis, culminating in the Battle of Hastings. The Duke of Normandy, better known as William the Conqueror, became the King of England. This was the beginning of a new era, both for the country and its soon-to-be capital. Within the next decade, William had begun a major construction project, a fortified tower to the east of the city. It was known as the White Tower, and it was the first building in the complex that would become the Tower of London. The site would expand over the years, with additions from subsequent rulers. The Tower of London was a castle, a citadel, a royal residence, a prison, and the home of the crown jewels. The tower would play a key role in English history over the centuries. If you wanted to control the country, you needed control of the tower. In early medieval times, Westminster was not yet the official seat of government. However, it was becoming more firmly established as the center of political power. Grand government halls were built in during this period, and by the late 12th century, London had its first ever mayor, a sign of the city's growing importance and need for governance. The population was steadily growing. In the year 1200, London had about 30,000 inhabitants, and by 1300, the population had grown to 80,000. It was by far the most populous city in England and among the largest in Europe. While London was smaller than Paris, it was now larger than Rome, which shrunk to as few as 30,000 inhabitants during the medieval era. One of the reasons for London's growing population was immigration. Many people moved to the city in search of commercial opportunities. This included merchants and traders from countries such as France, Denmark, and Germany, as well as a large Jewish community. However, there was ongoing tension and anti-Jewish violence in the city, and by the late 13th century, London's Jewish community had been forced to leave the country. Unfortunately, even the most diverse and cosmopolitan cities have a darker side to their history. London is no exception. There was also a downside to the city's growing population, the challenge of sanitation. Medieval London was filthy. Streets were filled with excrement and open sewers that sometimes flowed into the Thames. The presence of slaughterhouses, fishmongers, and tanneries would have added to the pungent atmosphere. There were some efforts to clean up the city, for example, legislation that prohibited rubbish from being thrown in the river. But on the whole, London would remain a dirty and polluted city for centuries to come. Poor sanitation aside, medieval London seems to have been an impressive and even beautiful city with its palaces, mansions, and churches. In this period, many churches were built or rebuilt, including the church that's now known as Old St. Paul's Cathedral. There had been a church on Ludgate Hill since as early as the 7th century, but in 1087 the building was destroyed by a fire. The construction of the new cathedral began soon after and continued for more than 200 years. By the early 14th century, St. Paul's was one of the grandest churches in Europe, a vast structure with a tall spire and beautiful stained glass windows. However, this is not the St. Paul's Cathedral that we see today. The old St. Paul's was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in the 17th century, but we'll get to that later. Another victim of the city's frequent fires was London Bridge. Over the decades, the wooden bridge was damaged by a succession of fires and even a tornado in the year 1091. The tornado wreaked havoc on London, destroying hundreds of buildings. In the words of a contemporary historian, it was a great spectacle for those watching from afar, but a terrifying experience for those standing near. The wooden London Bridge sustained significant damage over the years, and at last, in 1176, construction work began on a new stone bridge. This grand structure was lined with shops and houses. At the time, it was the longest inhabited bridge in Europe. London Bridge would remain the only stone crossing over the Thames in central London until the 18th century, when Westminster Bridge was built. Poor sanitation, fires, and natural disasters were not the only challenges facing medieval London. There were also numerous outbreaks of famine and the plague, which both had a devastating impact. The bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, struck in 1348. In London, there were as many as 200 fatalities each day, and it would take more than 150 years for the city's population to recover. But recover it did. And while the late medieval period was a difficult one for London, the Tudor city would slowly bounce back. The Tudor period in England began in 1485 with the reign of King Henry VII and ended in 1603 with the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Generally speaking, this was a prosperous time for London. The city was quickly becoming one of the most important centers of trade and commerce in Europe. Companies formed to take advantage of new opportunities not just in continental Europe but also Russia, the Levant, and even the Americas. Filled with bustling marketplaces, London was transforming into an increasingly wealthy and dynamic city, one that could rival other European capitals. And despite further outbreaks of the plague and other diseases, including the mysterious sweating sickness, the population of London continued to increase. During the Tudor period, the city grew from 50,000 to 200,000 inhabitants. Once again, this was due in part to steady immigration. Foreigners flocked to London and the settlements on its borders, such as Southwark, Shoreditch, and Clerkenwell. These towns and villages would gradually become part of London itself. Many of the immigrants in this era were Protestants. They were fleeing persecution in Catholic countries such as France and Spain. But London wasn't always welcoming to these new arrivals. Xenophobia was common, and some immigrants would end up leaving England for the Netherlands, which was seen as a more tolerant place. London's growing population required more space. While legislation attempted to contain the City of London, inevitably it began to spread beyond its walls. In the 16th century, the urban sprawl moved both westwards, to the area known as St. Giles, and eastwards. This era saw the development of areas that would later form the East End, places like Spitalfields and Whitechapel. In a relatively short space of time, fields lined with hedgerows became streets lined with small houses, tanneries, and breweries. East London was home to many of the city's poorer residents. Others lived across the river in Southwark, or within the old walls of the City of London itself, often in cramped, overcrowded housing. Aristocrats, on the other hand, enjoyed more spacious, luxurious surroundings in areas such as the Strand. However, many mansions and palaces were built outside the city, in what was then the countryside, places like Lambeth and Fulham. One of the most extravagant Tudor buildings, Hampton Court Palace, was built 12 miles away from the center of London. For a period, it was one of the residences of King Henry VIII. He needed space for his vast court, not to mention tennis courts, bowling alleys, and a hunting park. But aside from the issue of space, even the more affluent parts of Tudor chose to live elsewhere. However, by the 16th century, London offered something irresistible, a world of culture and entertainment. Now, this wasn't exactly something new. Medieval London also had plenty of attractions, jousts and tournaments, ice skating on the Thames, and the brothels of Southwark. Tudor London also offered some more lowbrow forms of entertainment, like cockfighting and bear baiting. But now there was even more to see and do, from live music in taverns to archery competitions and the game of football, at the time a rather violent sport. The city was also home to artists, poets, and playwrights. A lively cultural scene emerged in London, with traveling theatrical companies putting on performances. But in the late 16th century, plays were subject to censorship, and then banned completely within the City of London's jurisdiction. Theatrical performances were thought to be immoral, attracting vagrant persons. A more reasonable objection, perhaps, was that they posed a public health risk. Large crowds might spread the plague. So, theater companies had to head to the outskirts of London to look for venues. They even built new ones. One noteworthy example is the Globe Theatre, which was built across the river in Southwark in 1599. The plays performed there included works by a particularly talented writer, who was living in London at the time, William Shakespeare. London continued to thrive in the first half of the 17th century, during the Stuart period. But by the mid-17th century, England and its capital were facing a cluster of challenges, which were unprecedented in their scale and timing. The English Civil Wars, the Great Plague, and the Great Fire of London, all within just a couple of decades. For the average Londoner, these last two events had the most immediate impact. The Great Plague began in 1665 and lasted for about 18 months. About 100,000 people lost their lives, a quarter of London's population. The poor were most affected, as the rich were able to flee the city for their country estates. Then, in September 1666, just as life in the capital was slowly starting to return to normal, a bakery caught fire. The bakery was located in Pudding Lane, in the heart of the city of London. Now, at this time, the layout of central London was still more or less medieval. Imagine a city of narrow, winding alleys, where many of the buildings were made of wood, with thatched roofs. The bakery fire spread rapidly and lasted for several days. It destroyed much of the city of London, gutting buildings and leaving many people homeless. Samuel Pepys, the famous chronicler of London life, climbed a church steeple to look out over the smoldering ruins of the city. He described it as, "the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw." In the aftermath of the fire, much of London had to be rebuilt. This included the city's great cathedral, St. Paul's. The new building was designed in Baroque style by the renowned architect Sir Christopher Wren, who also oversaw the rebuilding of many other churches in London. For more than 200 years, St. Paul's was the tallest building in the city, dominating the skyline. And, to this day, with its elegant facade and majestic white dome, it remains one of London's most iconic landmarks. Another consequence of the Great Fire was that many Londoners were pushed outwards. The fire, combined with population growth, accelerated the city's spread, both east and west, as new homes were built. Over time, areas such as Soho, Bloomsbury, and Covent Garden became residential neighborhoods. The unstoppable urban sprawl had begun. Over the following centuries, many surrounding settlements would gradually be swallowed up by the expanding city. This explains why some present-day London neighborhoods, Islington, for example, or Hampstead, have such a distinctive feel. They were originally separate villages. This period of war, disease, and disaster in the 17th century inevitably took a toll on the city. But London was resilient as always. The 18th century saw a period of rapid population growth, geographical expansion, and a booming economy. In the early 18th century, the population of London was about 630,000. By the end of the century, around 1 million people lived in the city. There were a few factors behind this robust growth: declining infant mortality, rising fertility, and increased migration. Many French Protestants migrated to London during this period. There was also a significant increase in the Irish and Jewish populations, as well as a growing black community. Some black Londoners were in domestic service, while others were people who had formerly been enslaved. They'd arrived in London via the Caribbean or North America. This included veterans of the American Revolution who had fought for the British. In many ways, 18th-century London was a thriving, prosperous city, enjoying a golden age of culture. Famous institutions like the British Museum and the Royal Opera House were founded during this period, and there were many important writers and artists working in London. But there was also a darker side to the city. Poverty remained widespread, and violent crime was common. In the summer of 1780, the city was rocked by a series of riots which came to be known as the Gordon Riots. Initially motivated by anti-Catholicism, an incident of looting and burning escalated into days of rioting. Targets included Downing Street and the Bank of England. And while law and order were eventually restored, the riots were extraordinarily destructive. The property damage in London has been likened to the levels of destruction in Paris during the course of the entire French Revolution. As we reach the 19th century, we can see the continuation and acceleration of many trends. Population growth, for example. London overtook Beijing to become the world's largest city. By the 1860s, more than 3 million people lived in London. And by the end of the century, the city was home to more than 6.5 million. This staggering growth was mainly driven by natural population increase and migration within Britain. But immigration from other countries also played a part. Ireland in particular, especially following the Irish famine. Many other immigrants were political or economic refugees from France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. London's Jewish population continued to grow, and there were also smaller communities from India, China, and Africa. By the mid-19th century, nearly 40% of Londoners had been born outside of the capital. Interestingly, this has remained fairly consistent ever since. In present-day London, 40% of residents were born abroad. Another factor behind the booming population in Victorian London was declining mortality. This was partly a result of improved sanitation and better access to food. Still, Victorian London had many serious problems, including extreme poverty and slum-like housing conditions. The novels of Charles Dickens, such as Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, portray the grim reality of life in London. Pollution was another major problem. London was nicknamed the Big Smoke because of the smoky atmosphere. This was caused both by industrial pollution and the sheer quantity of domestic fires. In this period, everything in the city took on a soot color, from the buildings to the grass, and apparently even the sheep that grazed in Regent's Park. However, in the 19th century, there were real concerted efforts to tackle these problems. While high levels of poverty remained a problem well into the 20th century, for many Londoners, quality of life gradually began to improve. During the Industrial Revolution, there were major changes across the country. These included the development of the railway. In the ever-growing capital city, there was an increasing need to reduce street congestion. Underground train travel offered the perfect solution. Work on the London Underground began in 1860, starting with the Metropolitan line, which opened a few years later. Further lines were added over the following decades. And by the end of the century, the London Underground, which later became widely known as the Tube, had millions of passengers. In terms of size, the Tube was later overtaken by underground networks in other cities, including New York and Shanghai. But it's worth noting that London was the pioneer, with the world's very first metro system. In the 19th century, Britain was at the height of its imperial power, and its capital was a city of global importance. London had become a hub of international trade and finance, a bustling metropolis that attracted immigrants, businessmen, and wealthy tourists. And in terms of culture, London was practically unmatched. The 19th century saw the foundation of more cultural institutions, including the National Gallery and the Tate Britain, as well as the construction of some of the city's great landmarks. These included Tower Bridge, Trafalgar Square, Big Ben, and the Houses of Parliament. Of course, by this point, government business had been taking place in Westminster for centuries. But the Gothic-style building we see today, the Palace at Westminster, is a mid-19th century reconstruction. As you can probably guess, the previous building had been destroyed by a fire. In Britain, the first half of the 20th century was defined by two major events, the First and Second World Wars. Between 1915 and 1918, London was bombed by German airships. Hundreds of civilians died during these attacks, and many more Londoners lost their lives during combat. But the Second World War, which began in 1939, had an even greater impact on London. The German bombing campaign, known as the Blitz, was particularly devastating. And while London wasn't the only target, the city suffered terrible losses. It's been estimated that during the course of the Second World War, as many as 30,000 Londoners were killed, and 1.5 million were made homeless. In 1939, London's population was huge, close to 8.6 million. But London was no longer the world's largest city. It had already been overtaken by New York City, and in the decades following the Second World War, London's population continued to decline, particularly in inner London. There were many reasons for this change, but in part it was due to housing shortages in London. In the aftermath of the war, many Londoners moved to the surrounding suburbs and towns. These places offered not just housing, but more space and cleaner air. And from the 1960s, for a complex variety of reasons, the government encouraged people to leave London. Towns in southern England were expanded, or even created from scratch. Milton Keynes, for example. The geographical expansion of London also slowed down in the mid-20th century. This was mainly due to government policies that aimed to limit urban sprawl. Increasingly, Londoners were pushed either out of the city or towards the edges. The population wouldn't rise again until the early 1990s. As London became a global financial hub, offering work opportunities and a higher quality of life, it became desirable once again. Today, London is home to nearly 9 million people, more than ever before, and its population is more diverse than ever. Over 300 languages echo through its streets, making it one of the most linguistically rich cities on the planet. The city's skyline tells the story of its evolution. Historic landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral stand proudly beside modern marvels like the Shard, a 95-story titan that seems to reach for the heavens. Though London may no longer be the world's largest city, it remains an indomitable force in global finance, culture, and tourism, an unrivaled capital whose influence reverberates across the globe. It's a city that shows no signs of losing its place as a global beacon, yet its future remains a tantalizing mystery. Will London continue to soar, climbing ever higher with a forest of skyscrapers? Or, in the face of a world reshaped by technology and remote work, will it shrink, its sprawling streets emptied, its significance diffused? Some might argue that London peaked in the 19th century, but that perspective depends on where you stand. Present-day London certainly faces its challenges, yet the average Londoner's quality of life has never been better. Just imagine what the people of ancient Londinium would think if they could see the city today. The glittering lights of the West End, the soaring glass towers, and the endless traffic streaming across bridges, with the Thames winding beneath it all. It would be beyond their wildest imaginings. London has risen, fallen, and reinvented itself time and time again. Whatever the future holds, it promises to be nothing short of extraordinary.